If someone had told me that the past could return not just as a reminder, but as a predator that devours the present, I wouldn't have believed it. I always thought that my childhood memories of the farmhouse in Oklahoma were just a warm corner in my mind, a place to retreat to on rainy evenings. But I was wrong. I was more wrong than I had ever been in my life. Tom, are you listening? Amelia's voice sounded distant, pulling me out of my thoughts. Yes, of course, I replied automatically, though I wasn't sure what she had asked. We were driving along the winding road leading to the village of Riverside, the place of my childhood. Endless fields stretched out around us, and occasionally, neat white houses appeared among them. The landscape looked so peaceful that it was hard to believe how much drama could be hidden behind this idyll. It's strange that your mom decided to celebrate her birthday in this house, Amelia said thoughtfully. After everything that happened, I remained silent. Grace, my mother, had always been an enigmatic woman. She could hide her feelings behind a radiant smile and a confident gaze. But behind this mask, there was always something more, an incessant motion, as if complex mechanisms were turning inside her, which no one could understand. When we finally turned towards the house, I was overcome by a strange feeling. It was as if something heavy hung in the air, like before a storm. This house, our old 2-story red brick mansion, stood like a fortress that time had bypassed. Everything around seemed almost the same as I remembered. The carved swing on the porch, the tall pines by the gate, and that almost ghostly sense of something unsaid. Grace met us at the door. She looked stunning for her 48 years, in a simple sea green dress, with her chestnut hair loose and a smile that seemed to light up the world. But there was something in her eyes that made me tense. Maybe it was fatigue, or no, I definitely saw something else there. Thomas, Amelia, she greeted us with a casual air, as if our arrival was an everyday occurrence. Welcome home. Home. The word sounded strange. This house had long ceased to be my home. We stepped inside and I was overwhelmed by a wave of memories. The scent of wood and old varnish, the soft light from the wall sconces, the large windows through which the sunset poured in. Everything was the same as before, but something had changed. It was as if the house breathed something new, as if it knew something I didn't. When the guests began to gather around the table, the atmosphere filled with laughter and conversation. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that behind the facade of the celebration, there was tension. Maybe it was just my imagination, but my mother's gazes, fixed on me, seemed too attentive, and her voice was a bit warmer than usual. How's your work, Tom? She asked, pouring me more wine. Everything's fine, Mom. Working as always. She nodded, but there was a strange flicker in her eyes, as if she wanted to ask something else but changed her mind. The celebration continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. This feeling grew, like a slowly winding spring. It became especially strong when I found myself alone in my old basement room. Everything here was the same as before. The old leather sofa, the large billiard table, the neon sign above the bed. It was as if time had stood still, and yet something was off. It was as if a shadow hung in the air, as if the walls knew more than I could imagine. When I heard the door creak behind me, I turned around and saw Grace. She stood in the doorway holding a glass of wine. Her eyes were slightly veiled with fatigue, but there was a fire in them that I couldn't understand. You know, she said, coming closer, this house holds many stories, and I think it's time to add another one to them. Her words sent a chill down my spine. What do you mean? The question echoed in my mind, but I didn't have time to ask. She smiled as if to ease the tension and sat down next to me, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I knew this was going to be an unusual evening, but I didn't expect it to change my life so much. I sat in my old room, sipping whiskey from a glass, trying to sort out my thoughts. Grace had gone upstairs to the guests, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room. The red neon light of the Welcome to Paradise sign above the bed lazily flickered, casting shadows on the walls. But neither the music nor this cozy dimness could drown out the buzzing in my head. Why did I feel so strange? This house had always been my refuge, a place where I could hide from the world. but now it seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, independent of me. I went upstairs to join the guests, but I couldn't stay in their company for long. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the discussions of successes and failures, it all sounded distant and alien. Even Amelia, who usually enjoyed such events, seemed distracted tonight. She sat in a corner with her phone, occasionally looking up at those around her. Meanwhile, Grace radiated energy. Her laughter, a bit louder than the others, seemed calculated to draw attention. She looked at me across the table longer than would be usual for maternal interest. When the guests began to leave, the tension in the room became palpable. Grace approached me, touching my shoulder. "Thomas, I know something is bothering you," she said softly, almost in a whisper. "Are you okay?" "Yes, Mom, I'm fine," I lied, feeling my throat go dry. Her gaze lingered on me a bit longer than I expected, and she finally nodded, stepping back. When the guests left, only the four of us remained. Amelia, Grace, her two old friends, and me. Amelia, citing fatigue, went upstairs to the guest bedroom. I felt the tension inside me growing. It was as if it hung in the air, slowly enveloping each of us. Grace turned on the music. Slow, almost hypnotic jazz filled the living room. Her friends began to gather their things, and within a few minutes, we were left alone. "Want to take a walk?" she suggested, taking her glass. "Why not?" I agreed, though something inside told me it wasn't the best idea. We stepped out onto the porch, and the cool night air touched my face. Grace leaned against the railing, looking at the night sky. "Remember how we used to come out here on summer evenings when you were a kid?" she said. "You always said the stars were brighter here than in the city." I nodded, remembering those moments. They were filled with warmth and peace. But now something had changed. This was not the same house, not the same night, and certainly not the same Grace I knew. "You know, Thomas," she began, turning to me, "sometimes I think the past clings to us too tightly. Even when we think it's behind us, it continues to live inside us." I felt my muscles tense. Her words sounded as if she knew something more than she was saying. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked, trying to hide my anxiety. "About you, about me, about us," she said with a slight smile. "You've grown up, but sometimes I think you're still that boy who hid from the world in his room." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I turned away, trying to steer the conversation in another direction, but I couldn't. This night was becoming increasingly strange. We returned to the house, and I found myself in my room again. Now it felt not cozy, but oppressive. The red light of the neon sign illuminated the dark corners, and the shadows on the walls seemed alive. When the door creaked, I turned around and saw Grace. There was no warmth in her eyes anymore, but instead, there was determination. "Thomas, we need to talk," she said. Her voice was firm and quiet, as if she was afraid someone else might hear. This night was just beginning, but I already knew it would change everything. She closed the door behind her, and we were left in silence, broken only by the hum of the neon sign. Grace stood in front of me, leaning against the wooden panel, her gaze both scrutinizing and anxious. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. But inside, anxiety was already boiling. Grace looked at me, slightly squinting her eyes as if choosing her words. "Thomas, have you ever felt like your life is wrong?" Her question came suddenly, like thunder on a clear day. I frowned. What did she mean? The question caught me off guard. "I don't understand what you mean," I said cautiously. She took a step forward, slowly, as if afraid to scare away her own thoughts. "All these years, I tried to create a safe world for you, but maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I deprived you of something important." Her voice sounded muffled, almost hushed. "Maybe I made you believe that life should be easy, that it should be comfortable. But sometimes I wonder, do you even know who you really are?" Her words cut deep, as if opening something I had long tried to hide. I felt a wave of protest rising inside me, but I couldn't find the words to respond. "You've always been more than just a son," she continued, her voice trembling, but with an unyielding strength. "You were my support, my reason to keep going, my pride. But today I see that something more than just our roles stands between us." Her words hit me like a cold shower. This was more than just a conversation between a mother and her son. It was something she had been hiding for years, something that was now bursting out like a volcano ready to erupt. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I whispered, though I was already afraid to hear the answer. Grace stepped closer, so close that I could smell her perfume. Faint, warm, familiar. But in that moment, it felt almost suffocating. "Thomas," she said, her voice growing softer, almost a whisper. "You feel it too, don't you?" My head spun. What did she mean? What was I supposed to feel? I took a step back, leaning against the edge of the table, but she remained motionless, as if waiting for an answer I couldn't find. "Mom," I finally exhaled, this isn't what you think." She tilted her head, and a shadow of a smile flickered in her eyes. "Then tell me what it is, Tom. Because I can't pretend anymore that nothing is happening." Her voice was firm, but there was a desperate plea in it. She reached out her hand as if to touch my face, but stopped midway, frozen. I stepped back again, and my heart raced. Everything seemed unreal, like a scene from a dream that suddenly turns into a nightmare. "We can't," I finally said, and my statement sounded like a hammer blow. Grace looked away, as if my words had hurt her. She stepped back, and her face showed a strange mix of disappointment and relief. "You're right," she whispered, as if talking to herself. "We can't." She turned to the door, paused for a moment, and gave me one last look. "Forgive me, Thomas. This was a mistake." Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, and the door closed behind her. I was left alone in the room, where every object, every shadow seemed foreign. I collapsed onto the sofa, trying to stop the trembling in my hands. What had just happened? What was she trying to say? And most importantly, why couldn't I just leave and forget about this conversation? The silence was deafening. I knew that this night would be the beginning of something bigger, something I could no longer ignore. I couldn't sleep. The red light of the neon sign slowly spread across the room, like blood, flowing over the walls and ceiling. I lay on the sofa, staring at the ceiling, but my thoughts kept racing in circles like hunted animals. The conversation with Grace was stuck in my head, and no attempt to push it away helped. What did she mean? Why did she look at me like that? And why did I feel like I had fallen into a deep pit from which I couldn't escape? By the time I heard soft footsteps on the stairs, hours had passed. Grace appeared in the doorway of my room, dressed in a simple dress that didn't hide her figure. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes shimmering, as if she had been crying or had drunk more than she could handle. "You're still not asleep?" she asked softly. "No," I replied briefly, getting up from the sofa. "I couldn't sleep," she continued, coming closer. "This house, it has always been a place of memories for me. But tonight, everything seems different." I didn't reply. Her words were soft, but there was an elusive note in them that made me tense. "Why don't we dance?" she suddenly suggested. "You always loved music." "Now?" I frowned, looking at her. She smiled, but there was something strange in that smile. She walked over to the old record player in the corner of the room and turned it on. Slow music filled the space, enveloping it with soft, almost hypnotic sounds. "Why not?" she replied, extending her hand to me. I took her hand, more out of inertia than desire. Our fingers touched, and I felt a shiver run down my skin. We began to move to the music, at first slowly, awkwardly, as if two strangers were trying to find a common rhythm. But soon that changed. Her hand wrapped around my neck, and our movement became smoother, almost natural. I felt the tension that had been building all day, gradually dissipating, giving way to a strange, inexplicable feeling. It was as if the music had merged us into one. "Thomas," she whispered, pressing closer, "you know I've always been proud of you." "I know," I replied, but my voice sounded hollow, as if someone else was speaking. "You are my greatest success and my greatest disappointment." Her words were filled with bitterness, but there was a strange sincerity in them. "Why a disappointment?" I asked, feeling something inside me breaking. She didn't answer. Instead, Grace looked up, and I met her eyes. At that moment, the music became almost inaudible, as if the whole world had stopped, leaving only the two of us. I saw so much pain, So much passion in her gaze that it was almost unbearable. I took a step back, trying to break this strange moment, but Grace held me by the hand. "Thomas," she said, and there was something new in her voice, something I couldn't define. "Don't go." "Mom, this is wrong," I muttered, but I couldn't find the strength to break free. "I know," she whispered, "but sometimes the boundaries blur." Her words sounded like a spell. Her eyes, her touch, her voice, everything was mesmerizing, drawing me in like a magnet. But inside me, a storm was already raging. I knew this was a line that shouldn't be crossed, but I also knew that we were already on the edge. The music continued to play, but I no longer heard it, only the beating of my own heart. Grace took the last step towards me, and I felt the world crumbling around me. At that moment, I wasn't thinking about what would happen next or how far we had already gone. There was only this moment, only this dance. Waking up, I felt a strange silence. It wasn't the usual peaceful morning silence, with birdsong and the rustling of leaves. This silence was oppressive, almost painful. I opened my eyes and saw the red light of the neon sign flickering on the walls. My mouth was dry, my head pounding from lack of sleep and too much alcohol. At first, I couldn't figure out where I was. Everything seemed hazy, like a scene from a dream you can't quite remember. But when I turned my head and saw Grace sleeping next to me, reality hit me like lightning. I sat up abruptly, feeling my world turning upside down. Fragments of the night slowly came together into a coherent picture, and that picture was monstrous. What had happened between Grace and me was unthinkable, unforgivable. I knew it, and yet it had happened. I quietly got up, trying not to wake her. My heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to echo through the house. I looked at her. She lay on her side, her face peaceful, almost serene. This contrast with what was going on inside me was unbearable. I threw on a shirt and left the room, heading to the bathroom. The mirror above the sink reflected a stranger, dull eyes, tense features, fear in the gaze. I washed my face with cold water, trying to cleanse myself, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Downstairs, I found Amelia in the kitchen. She was already awake and making coffee. Her face radiated warmth, which I could no longer bear. Every glance from her was a reminder of my betrayal. "Good morning," she said, smiling. "You look rough. Too much whiskey again?" I nodded, unable to respond. She placed a cup of coffee in front of me and hugged me. I felt even worse. "Is Grace still sleeping?" she asked, sitting down across from me. "I think so," I replied, avoiding her gaze. "Will we be leaving soon?" She looked calm, even happy, as if she suspected nothing. This only intensified my guilt. "Yes, soon. We need to wake Mom." An hour later, Grace came downstairs. She looked as if nothing had happened. Her smile was as warm as always, but I could see she was avoiding my eyes. "Good morning," she said, sitting down at the table. "How did you sleep?" Her words sounded as if it were an ordinary day. Amelia kept the conversation going, talking about her plans for the next week. I felt every word pressing down on me like a noose around my neck. When we left Grace's house, I finally exhaled, but instead of relief, there was emptiness. Amelia sat next to me, holding my hand as I drove along the winding road. I couldn't look at her. All I could think about was how far I had gone. The drive home felt endless. Amelia kept talking about trivial things, and I responded in monosyllables, afraid my silence would give me away. I knew I should tell her the truth, but I also knew I couldn't. It would destroy everything. That evening, when we got home, I was alone in my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring into space. Memories of that night kept surfacing, one after another, like pieces of a puzzle that wouldn't fit together. The phone vibrated. A message from Grace. "We can't discuss this. It will stay between us." I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of anger and horror. She was trying to brush aside what had happened, just as I was trying to do. But I knew it wouldn't work. What happened that night changed both of us forever. Months passed. Life seemed to return to its usual rhythm, but only on the surface. Inside, I was still burning. The fire of guilt and shame never subsided, consuming everything I had. Amelia seemed not to suspect anything, or at least she pretended not to notice. But I knew I had changed, and she saw it. Grace almost disappeared from my life. She left the village, selling the house where I had spent most of my childhood. We exchanged only rare, dry messages, as if trying to maintain a semblance of normality. But every time I saw her name on my phone screen, a wave of pain washed over me. One evening I came home from work and found Amelia in the living room. She was sitting on the sofa, holding a photo of Grace. "She sent this," Amelia said without looking up. "She wrote that she wants us to keep it." I took the photo. It was an old snapshot. Grace, very young, holding me as a baby in her arms. Her smile was wide, warm, genuine. I felt a pang in my chest. How had it all come to this? "Are you okay?" Amelia asked, looking at me. Her gaze was wary, as if she was trying to understand something. "Yes," I lied, putting the photo on the table. "Just tired." But I knew it was a lie. She knew it too. That night, lying in bed, I heard the phone vibrate. A message from an unknown number. I opened it, and a chill ran down my spine. "Do you remember that night?" "I remember. It changed everything. Sometimes I feel like I'm going crazy." "Do you too?" I knew who it was. Grace. It was the first message from her in weeks. Her words echoed my own thoughts. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying, "I remember." But it changes nothing. We have to move on. The response came almost instantly. "How?" "Thomas, tell me how." More weeks passed. I tried to build a wall between myself and the past, but it wouldn't let go. At night, I often woke up in a cold sweat, seeing that night, her gaze, our dance before my eyes. I couldn't shake it off. One morning, Amelia approached me in the kitchen. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. "Thomas," she said softly, sitting down across from me, "something is happening. I can feel it. You've distanced yourself. You're hiding something." I looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "You can tell me whatever it is," she continued, her voice trembling. "I want to help." My mind screamed, "Tell her the truth." But the words stuck in my throat. Tell her? Destroy everything? Or keep silent and try to preserve what was left of normality? "Everything is fine," I finally managed to say. "It's just work. It's exhausting." She nodded, but I could see she didn't believe me. A few days later, I received another message from Grace. This time it was short. "I'm leaving. Goodbye, Thomas." And that was it. There were no more calls, no letters, nothing. She disappeared like a ghost, leaving me alone with my memories. Years passed. I learned to live with it. The old pain dulled but never went away. Sometimes I caught myself searching for her, in crowds, in unfamiliar cities, in every old house I passed. But Grace never appeared. Amelia and I stayed together. We built a family, had another child. Life went on, but sometimes on particularly quiet nights, I found myself back in that room, back to that dance, back to that line we had crossed. And each time it felt as if I had just done it again. The night that divided my life into before and after will never fade from my memory. It will remain a part of me, a part of who I have become, a ghost of the past that I could not exorcise. If there are any specific parts you would like to adjust, or if you need further assistance, please let me know.